They can just raise it. They don't have to ask you. They can just do it. And if you look at countries in Europe and elsewhere that have VAT taxes, you'll see that's the case. There's also in this provincial budget a $4.5 billion direct giveaway tax giveaway to the corporations. That's $9 billion. And at the same time, they're telling us that they can't afford to put in place a job creation plan for the people of Ontario. They can't do anything about the 500,000 jobs in manufacturing that have disappeared in Ontario in the last 7 years. They can't do anything about skyrocketing tuition fees. They won't even cap them, let alone turn them back. They can't do anything about health care. In fact, the figures that they put out in the provincial government in the provincial budget were designed to scare the dickens out of everybody. That how are we going to, 70 cents of every dollar, that's what will go to health care in the future. So obviously it's not sustainable, so you'll have to take less. That's the message. Of course, they forget to say that because of all their tax giveaways to the big corporations and lots more, loopholes and all the rest of it, that the pie is shrinking. So if you shrink the pie in terms of revenue, of course the expenditure is going to look bigger because the pie is smaller. And who did that? Who was it who turned the taps off and said, you don't have to pay anymore? You don't have to pay the capital tax for doing that one in, and so on and so forth. So we're in a big battle. And our enemies are bigger than they used to be. They're just as greedy, by the way, but they're bigger because they're multinationals now. And so when you have a company like Valley Inco in Sudbury, Canadian operations, which are pretty important to Canada, are only 3% of its operations in nickel worldwide. They got deep pockets, and they can wait out these workers forever. And that strike could be lost. And if it is lost, what do you think is going to happen? We're going to see defined contribution, pension takebacks right across the mining sector, wage cuts right across the mining sector, and right through the public sector. That's already started. That's what a wage freeze is all about. And it isn't a freeze, folks, it's a cut. Because with a 2% increase in inflation every year, which is what projected, and it might be higher, that's a wage cut. And if you happen to be a woman working for a city hall or working in a hospital and you're part-time, that works out to a week's wages. So that's a wage cut. So I think everybody here has pretty well got the picture. The question is for us, what to do about it? What to do about it? And that's really difficult if you live in Ontario or if you live in Canada, because there isn't, I dare say, a single government anywhere in Canada which can be clearly identified as being for working people. There isn't even a party, I would say, in office that can be identified as, yeah, they'll do, with all their thises or that's, they'll do for us. Most people don't think that way. And you can see why. Most people might say, well, the NDP, they're probably okay. Well, a lot of people thought that until Bob Rae came along. And very sadly, really sadly, because working people have very few allies these days in office, in government, the NDP leader, Andrea Horwath, said, we're not going to react to the wage freeze. You can't put us in a box, they said to the media. Well, working people across this province could ask, well, why the hell didn't you say something? Why didn't you speak up? What are you there for? Who do you speak for? Who do you speak for? And if Canadians are cynical, by God, there's a good reason. If they're not so interested in racing to the polls, well, I think it's understandable. Nevertheless, we got to do something about parliaments and legislatures. We have to, because if we don't, we're going to see the Harperites not only send the current troops to Afghanistan, oops, sorry, got carried away there, sorry. It's worth getting carried away for, don't you think? We have to get out of Afghanistan, and that means we've got to have a government, or at least parties with enough votes to do that. And I'm guessing, folks, that in 2011, something is going to happen where we just got to stay there. For whatever reasons, it'll be humanitarian or what have you, or whatever they say, but you know what's going to happen. They're going to continue the military exercises.
It's okay, you
Thank
speak.
you, brother.
You speak. You can hear.
So it is important who's in government and who's in power, even minority. It's amazing what they've been able to do with the minority. And not only that, they're busily and pretty effectively getting rid of medicare in this country. The country is being emptied of industry. We're going to be a source of raw resources for the U.S. We're going to have that great big tar sands. It's not an oil sands, it's a tar sands. And they're going to develop it. They've made that clear. What can we expect from the Liberals? Well, it's sad. It's really sad. I was at some of those meetings around Bill C-50. This is the Immigration Act changes. And in Brampton. And the story from the Liberals there was, we can't just do anything we want to, even though we want to, because we're in a government in waiting and we have responsibilities, and that's why we're going to let it go. And that's why we have Bill C-50. They could have stopped it, but they didn't. So how do we go about changing these governments? Well, to some degree, we have to get people to start looking outside the box. If you settle for what's there, that's what you'll get. So we want people to start looking at policy, voting for policy, and for candidates and parties that are prepared to fight for those policies, like immigration policy. What kind of immigration policy do we want? What kind of Canada do we want? What kind of taxation policy do we want? Well, in our view, we should tax the rich. It's obvious. A taxation policy which will generate revenues to pay for social programs, to roll back tuition fees, to introduce a national child care program, and so on and so forth. Needs money. Where are you going to get it? Well, who makes the money? Last time I looked, there were record profits coming in. Record profits from those big banks and corporations, the one that we just bailed out. So we need a progressive tax policy based on ability to pay, and they're the ones who have the ability to pay. And they're the ones who should pay. And we need a policy, a foreign policy of peace and disarmament. And if we proceed the way that we're proceeding now, folks, it will not be too long before we will be back in the nuclear nightmare. Either we disarm or we'll blow up the world. Somebody's going to do it at some point. You look at Harper, he's one of the guys who might do it. So all of these things. So we think that, a different set of policies. And it's not enough for us to be out in the streets against what they're doing. That's the first step. And there's lots more people who should be out there on the streets against what they're doing. But we also need to have something we're for. We need policies for people that put people's needs, not corporate greed, on the agenda. And we would like to suggest to you that, with all I've said about parliaments, that we aren't the only ones who think this way. We know that there are people in the NDP who are not very happy with what Andrea Horwath said, or what one of her deputies said on the whole issue of that rotten little motion that was put by Sherman in the Ontario legislature, equating criticism of Israel with hate speech. What was the NDP doing there? That was pretty bad. They need a wake-up call too. So people need to be in the streets. That's what will change their mind. And I'll give you the proof. You want to know the proof? The proof is that 2 weeks ago, 75,000 people were on the streets in Montreal. And I bet you hardly anybody in English-speaking Canada knows that that happened. And that's the proof. They know that if this is infectious, and I suggest it is infectious, that Canadians, working people in English-speaking Canada are not any less militant or any less concerned than people in Quebec. But what they have in Quebec is a labor movement that has put out a call to action across the province. And that's what we need here. We need a coalition of labor, people's organizations, Aboriginal organizations, racialized people, seniors, youth, women, environmentalists, all of the forces that have been negatively affected by these transnational corporations and their agenda of greed, to come together and to organize and mobilize the kinds of actions that we saw during the days of action in the 1990s, where the whole city stopped in Toronto virtually. A piece of proof that I'd offer to you is what's happening in Europe. We're not the only people facing these problems, you all know that. And people around the world are struggling. The Cubans have been at it for more than 50 years. successfully, 60 years. The people of Venezuela, struggling. People all over Latin America, changing governments successfully. That's a real success. And moving in the direction of socialism. People in Europe struggling. Look at what's happening in Greece. Big demonstrations everywhere. And these are people who are organized and mobilized by the labor movement and its allies, a group called PAME, which pulls people out to fight against these austerity programs, and they've been very successful. They've been really successful in mobilizing people. And at some point, you know, the penny drops. It isn't just this government that's rotten, it's the whole bloody system that's rotten and that has to go. And me, I've spent my entire life fighting against capitalism. I'm not going to stop now. And I invite you to join me. And I don't think... Just going back to the comments that my brother made here about First Nations people, I agree with that absolutely. But I'm not a colonist, and I bet you aren't either. We are the people who are speaking out against these things, who are fighting these things. If you're fighting it, you're not a part of it. You're on the other side. And you know the old labor side. Which side are you on? Well, we all know which side we are on. The thing now is to mobilize, challenge these governments, change it. The only force that we have is our unity and our mobilization. And that's what brings about change, and that's what we need.